wanted to kind of begin with a question this morning, because I think that a lot of times when we think of churches, right, we think of these places where we get questions, or at least maybe a place has an answer to some of our questions. We associate churches a lot of times with like those deep, like soul-searching, like identity-defining questions. And my question for you this morning is not like one of those questions at all, actually. In fact, it's kind of the opposite as far as how deep it is. It's pretty shallow. But my question is, I want to know if anyone in here has seen the movie The Place Beyond the Pines. Yeah, obviously, I watched it with y'all Monday on Labor Day. Is that one of your favorites, Ian? Yeah, I thought it was one of Ian's favorites. I enjoy it. I think it's pretty good. If you want to hear an opposite opinion, you can ask Matt Barty, not his favorite movie. But it's okay. Still thought it was all right. But, so it's a movie that came out in 2012, if you're unfamiliar with it. It's got Ryan Gosling and Bradley Cooper in it, which I'm pretty sure shouldn't be allowed, right? It's going to do too well at the box office, those two people. But it's a really good movie, I think. But the reason I'm talking about it is because I think it does something that is really, really interesting as far as storytelling is concerned. So the premise of the movie, and this is a minor spoiler, but I mean, you've had 10 years to see it at this point, so, right, it's kind of deserved. But Ryan Gosling plays a guy named Luke, and he is part of like a traveling circus, essentially. And he rides dirt bikes or motorcycles for this traveling circus, but he rides them in those like little metal balls with like two other people where they like almost hit each other. You know what I'm talking about? They call him Handsome Luke, and his posse is the Heartthrobs. And so Ryan Gosling's got like bleach blonde hair. He's got like tattoos all over himself, which in 2012 was like edgy. Now it's just like your neighbor Joe, right, with a bunch of tattoos. But back then, it was kind of like an edgy thing, right? So he's like smoking cigarettes all the time, and he's kind of this portrayal of what I think the movie's authors are trying to say is like a stereotypical lowlife, all right? If you are a tattooed, cigarette-smoking, dirt bike rider, I'm sorry, I'm not calling you a lowlife. I'm saying the movie was trying to portray this, I think, at least, okay? But he finishes one of his shows, and he sees this woman who's Eva Longoria, which is his now actual wife, which is kind of cool. But in the movie, he sees her, and she's like, hey, do you remember me? And he's like, yeah, I remember you. I called you Ro. So I guess the implication is they had met at some point when his circus was in this town before. And he gives her a ride home. And afterwards, or at her home, he's like, hey, do you want to go for a drink or something? She's like, no, I have a man now. I just wanted to see you. He's like, okay, whatever. As the watcher, you're kind of like, that's weird. I don't really understand what's going on. He goes back the next night. Her mom answers the door, and she's holding a baby. Surprise, she had a kid, and it's his, right? So now her just wanting to see him makes a little bit more sense, right? And the rest of the first act is essentially Ryan Gosling, or Luke, trying to decide what he wants to do because now he is a father, okay? The traveling circus he's with is supposed to like leave the next day. So what does he decide to do? He decides to quit and find work in the town where this woman is with his child, finding work, whatever he can. Turns out the only thing he can find work doing is robbing banks, okay? So he is essentially this dirt bike rider who rides in, robs banks, and then rides away and drives in the back of a U-Haul where the guy slams the door shut as soon as he rides in, and they get away with it. And essentially, the point is that Ryan Gosling drops everything in his life to try to give what he can to his kid the only way he knows how, all right? Halfway through the movie, though, there's a distinct kind of transition of acts, and you see Bradley Cooper. Bradley Cooper's a clean-cut, all-American guy. He's a cop. And one of Ryan Gosling's bank heists goes wrong. And so he is driving away, and Bradley Cooper's chasing him. And he follows him into a house. And essentially, what happens is Bradley Cooper goes in and shoots him. Because Ryan Gosling had been on the run after he just robbed this bank. And he's talking to the mom of his child. And he's like, hey, I think I'm about to get locked up for a while. Promise me you won't tell our kid about me. That's all he wants, is for his kid not to know about him. Bradley Cooper goes in, he shoots him. When he shoots him, Ryan Gosling falls out the second-story window, but he shoots him in the process. So Bradley Cooper wakes up in the hospital, and he is greeted by everyone around him calling him a hero. They're like, man, I cannot believe what you've gone through. I can't believe this. And the second act of the movie follows Bradley Cooper. And he is, like I said, the stereotypical all-American guy. Clean cut, nice, charismatic, and he has a baby boy. Same age that Ryan Gosling did. And the second act of the movie follows Bradley Cooper as a dad. And what happens is that essentially you see Bradley Cooper start to kind of treat his wife and his child like a chore. Even though he's married, they have a house, he has a nice career, his wife, his kid, they start to get in the way of the things that he wants to do. He views him as an obstacle, as a nuisance. And what I think is interesting about this movie, I'm not going to reveal the third act. You can watch it. I won't spoil it totally. But what's really cool, I think, is that rather than making any statements on the people in it or how they act, what I think the movie does so well is they use you as the viewer's presumptions and ideas and beliefs about what you think a good dad is, and it kind of tries to subvert those a little bit. It says, hey, we know when you see Ryan Gosling, sure, you're going to think he's attractive because it's Ryan Gosling, but you're going to be like, what is this chain-smoking, dirt bike riding, bank robbing guy going to, like, who is this guy? And then you see him literally sacrifice everything in his life to try to give all he can to his kid. And then Bradley Cooper, who should be stand-up hero, views his kid as someone who is a chore. And actually, he sacrifices his kid, not literally, but or his relationship with his kid for his own political career and the advancement of his own desires. See, paralleling and contrasting is a really effective way of storytelling. It can subvert or undermine a lot of what we think we know about something, right? Storytellers do it all the time. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is not because I want you to watch the movie. Sure, yeah, watch it. It's fun. There's some scenes in it, I will say, that if scenes of injustice make you uncomfortable, you'll feel really uncomfortable. We watched it with our friend Mike, and he watched it from the back hallway for a while because he felt uneasy. He's a little bit dramatic. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that I actually think the flood story is an example of this exact kind of storytelling. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially, if you don't know this, then one of the first things we have to acknowledge about the flood story with Noah is that almost every single ancient Near Eastern culture we have record of has a flood story of their own. All right? I'm talking about Egyptians, Babylonians, Chaldeans, all of these people. They had their own flood stories in their religious texts, in the history of their people. That's how they told it. They had a flood story. In fact, one of the earliest pieces of literature we have, does anybody know what it is from Mesopotamia? Yes, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Thank you, Matt. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, they have a way of dating, literature. I don't know exactly how it works. It's kind of like counting the rings on a tree trunk, I guess, but they do that. And one of the oldest things we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a story about a guy named Utnapishtim, all right? And if you're not familiar with him, that's okay. If you want to write him down and you want to spell it right on your first try, that's amazing. I'll check it afterwards. You get bonus points. But he goes to the gods of storms and thunder of the Mesopotamian culture, right? And this is a really big oversimplification, but essentially he goes to the god of storm and thunder, annoys the god of storm and thunder. The god of storm and thunder is like, you know what? I'm going to flood the earth and kill everyone because y'all suck. Utnapishtim, what do you think he does? He builds a raft, takes a bunch of animals, puts them on the raft, and outsmarts the god of thunder and storms, and humanity survives. That is how the Mesopotamians understood their flood story. I don't know about you, but I don't read that and get really excited. Like, yay, we outsmarted the gods. Like, go humans, right? Like, but that was for them how they understood it. So, we have to start to ask, what is the author of this story doing by intentionally choosing and using a flood story? What are they trying to draw to mind of the original listeners? What would people have been thinking? And I will say that this is like a big, like, nuanced thing. I'm not here to answer whether or not like a flood happened or didn't happen. I don't know, okay? Maybe it could have. And I do think that historians, they make a really interesting point when they say that there's something called historical cultural memory, which is essentially this idea that if this many cultures tell a story about something, did something actually happen, then that's a good point. And I think it's worth considering. But to be honest, I don't know the answer. Like, I wish I did. I wish I had a time machine. But I don't think that the heart of this story is about whether or not this flood actually happened or not. I think the heart of this story is subverting and contrasting the God of this story with all of the other flood accounts that the people in the ancient Near East had. So, that being said, what is this story about? Well, I don't think it's about humanity outsmarting a wrathful God, like Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? I don't think it's that. I think the point of this story is that the Hebrew people, they have a God that is wholly unlike any other God that the ancient Near Eastern cultures told them about. This is a God who is separate, who is totally set apart from, who is unlike any other God in any other story that these people heard. So if you were here the past couple weeks, then you'll know this, but we've been using a lot of what's called the Bema Discipleship Podcast. They are kind of looking at like rabbinic, kind of traditional Hebrew teachings of the Torah and the Old Testament. And so one of the things they talk about is how Hebrew poetry works, because this is Hebrew poetry, right? And I don't know about you, but I'm not an expert in poetry, nonetheless, ancient Near Eastern Hebrew poetry. So with that being said, there's a couple things I think we would do well to remember. Essentially, or primarily, I guess, that Hebrew poets use numbers and patterns to communicate really effective things, right? Has anybody ever seen the memes on Twitter where, like, in order to make a point about someone saying something stupid, you, like, capitalize every other letter? Has anyone seen that? Yeah, they didn't have that as an option, right? Or maybe they did, but it would have been a huge waste of their tablets because they had limited resources, limited time, and it was really hard to write things down on tablets, right? In fact, most of the people, they heard these stories read out loud. So they had to find different ways to communicate, ways that stood out. They couldn't just go into Microsoft Word and hit bold, right, like I can. So they used numbers and patterns and structures. They inserted things into the writing to make these stand out as the original audience listened to it. One of the most common forms of this is called a chiasm, if you remember that. A chiasm. It is a pattern in Hebrew poetry that is essentially forming like this pattern, kind of like a ladder. So Sarah, I think you have, all right, here we go. This is the chiastic structure of the Genesis flood. And it's hard to describe what a chiasm is, but it's that. It's something that builds to where there's a center, all right? If you'll notice, A corresponds with A, B with B, C with C, all that, until you have a center. And the whole reason they did this was because the center was essentially saying, hey, if you're listening, pay attention to this. This is what I'm bolding and underlining and putting in all caps, right? This is the point. So what is the point of this story? It is that God remembers Noah. In this flood story, where the Hebrew people would have heard it and known all the other flood stories. They would have known about how humans get on God's nerves and God's lash out because they're annoyed and they're angry and they just want to wipe away humanity. In the middle of those stories where the Hebrew people know that in the back of their consciousness, we have a story about a God who remembers Noah. Now, I don't know if that's like really moving for you. If it is, then that's amazing. I pray it is. For me, at least, maybe I'm just a little bit more difficult or high maintenance. I hear that and I'm like, what? Like, did God forget that in the middle of this story, he has said he's going to wipe away every other human, the things made in his image, and now all of a sudden he remembers Noah? Like, was God like, I'm so busy sending the rain that I forgot about Noah and his family? I don't know if you've given yourself permission to like engage in the text this way, but over the past couple weeks, I've been trying to just pay attention to how I feel when I read it and like what naturally comes up in my head and like what questions and issues I have with it, because one of the things the Baymont podcast talks about a lot is how the issues we have is usually where the like treasure's waiting to be found. And for me, at least, this was an issue for me. So I was like, what does God have on his mind other than the only people left on earth who are alive, right? So what's the point of God remembering Noah? Well, I think when you look at this story, there's some really important things that happen that make remembering a really big deal, okay? In this story, after the flood and after the other side of it, God makes a covenant with Noah. In fact, he makes a covenant that he's never going to do this again. That unlike the other gods, that God will not go off in a tizzy and just annihilate stuff for the sake of annihilating stuff. You see, God says actually that he's going to give us a sign of this covenant. Something that we can look to and we can remember when we're afraid and we're like, man, things are getting really bad. Surely this evil must need to be purified in the world because God is a just God and the justice of God can't tolerate this any longer. He's given us something to remember it too. And what is he given us to remember this covenant? Anyone? A rainbow, that's right. That's how we know it in the children's stories. In the Hebrew, it just says bow. Anyone, what comes to your mind when you think of a bow? There has to be at least one like good old hunting boy in here, right? I've never shot a bow or a gun, but it'd be fun to shoot a bow one day. But when we hear bow, right, the first thing we think of, bow and arrow, right? It is a weapon. So when we see the bow that God has put as a marker of his covenant, which way is the bow facing? Up. Right? So we have a sign that God will no longer aim destruction or violent forces at his good creation, the earth. In fact, as Christians, if you want to get messianic with it, you can even say that God has aimed the weapon of destruction at himself. Because for ancient Near Eastern people, they understood God as being above in the heavens, right? The skies. So we have a God who has placed a bow in the clouds and pointed it at himself, and he has said that I know when to stop. I will no longer destroy the earth like I have in the past. This is going to be totally different than any understanding of God that you have had up until this point. So we have a chiasm that says that God remembers Noah. It's really, really important. What if I told you there was another chiasm in this? So this is kind of confusing, and for me even, it's like, really, like this, can they really have done this? But I think that it's part of what makes the Bible like divinely inspired, and it's so beautiful. But in this whole passage, the Hebrew word for earth, which is haaretz, occurs 7 times. One thing that's really cool about odd numbers, they have centers, right? 3 on either side, 1 in the middle. So, earth, 7 times. Hebrew word for cloud appears 5 times. Hebrew word for rainbow, it appears 3 times. And the Hebrew word for covenant, which is brit, appears 7 times. All these odd numbers have a center. What if I told you that all those numbers in this passage, that for whatever reason they have a center, that they formed the exact verses found in chapter 9, verses 14 and 15? That verse is usually translated, whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. So you have these authors somehow constructing this beautiful way to all point to a center where it is saying that this is a God who will remember to be faithful to his creation and to know when to say enough when it comes to justice and destruction and purifying of evil. See, the first 2 weeks in the Genesis story, this chiasm built to this like amazing climax moment of God saying, you know what? I'm going to rest. That's enough. I know when to stop creating, right? I know when to rest. And now in this story, as the story has continued, we have a God who knows when to stop destroying. A God who knows when to say justice has been brought. It is enough. And in this story, there is a God who is not vindictive and short-fused and temperamental with humanity, but a God who remembers humanity and has promised to remain faithful to them and to even aim the divine act of judgment that the universe desperately needs at himself. To say that I will bear the price of the evil that has been brought into the world. See, as Christians, we're able to see that in the person of Jesus, that God remembers this covenant. The ultimate fulfillment of this covenant, the ultimate fulfillment of a bow being aimed at the clouds, a weapon of destruction. It says that Jesus himself, that he paid that price. That he bared that burden. This is not a God that the Hebrew people heard about in other cultures. This is not a God who we need to be afraid of is going to snap one day. That we need to be afraid of, that our conceptions of this God that we sometimes tell ourselves stories about are things to hide from, are things to run from. This is a God who remembers a covenant made with the people. And who says that I will be faithful to this covenant no matter what. You see, this passage, if you look at the chiasm and see, it says the earth is filled with violence and corruption. If you look at C again, it goes down and in this passage again, there's still evil and corruption. And I don't know about you, but there are so many times where I am like terrified that God is going to lash out or do something or like send fireballs from heaven because there's so much evil and corruption in the world. Maybe I'm just like cynical or maybe, but like I look out and I see so much evil and corruption all the time and I'm like, surely God, we don't deserve this. Like we don't deserve to still be breathing sometimes. Like God, I'm terrified that you're going to act out. I'm terrified that you're going to send something down that is going to make this miserable for all of us. And yet God says that he will only ever do it upon himself. That yes, there will be a judgment one day, of course, but that God has bared the burden. That God has made a way for all things to be made new, to be created new. That the God that we sang about who is faithful, the God of promises, that God will no longer lash out. Like we see in this story, like these people knew from the flood. So, all of that to say, again, I don't know how this happened or if it happened or what the point of like them telling the story like this is. I don't know. But I do know that in this story, the people of Israel could look out at the other ancient Near Eastern cultures and say, our God is different. Our God is fundamentally different from your understandings of the gods and how the earth came to be and how destruction came to be. And if there was a flood, here's why. And here's why we know that this God will never act out again like this, that this God has promised to bear that price. So as we head to communion this morning, we're going to take bread and juice. If you have never taken it here before, it's on the tables around you, behind you. But Jesus says that this is what we do in remembrance of him. That his body was broken and his blood was poured out as a divine fulfillment of that promise. As one who could make a way for us to enter into this beautiful relationship with God. So as we take communion this morning, I just want to invite you to reflect on that. Look in this story, look for the parts that are troubling, like look for the things that are an issue for you, and press into them. If you want to pray, there's people at the Respond banner back there. I think that's Gilly. I've never seen that hat before. I like it. What's up? But we'd love to pray with you. If you want to pray with people you came with, they'd love to pray with you. But yeah, let's pray, and you'll be dismissed to communion. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you that your kindness and your mercy knows when to stop destroying. God, like, I don't know, maybe we read this passage and we're like, I can't imagine a good God bringing destruction. But we know that for these people, like, of course there was a story about a God bringing a flood. That was all they knew. And not only that, but that God, that sometimes, like, the purification of evil is a complex and weighty thing that we can't fully grasp. And you tell us that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of you, but we don't have to be afraid of you like we're afraid of, like we're a kid who's been bitten by a dog and is afraid of dogs when we see them, not knowing if they're going to jump at us and bite us, not knowing what to expect. But God, that you have remembered Noah, and so you will remember us. That you love us, you care for us. And God, that ultimately that where judgment needed to happen, that Jesus, you were like humble enough to empty yourself of your divinity, even to the point of death on a cross. So Father, thank you for telling stories that subvert what we think we know, that completely undermine our understanding of how well we think we know the universe and like how things work, but that turn them on their head and say, this is who I am. You have never seen or heard of a God like me. We pray you would bless our time of communion. We pray this in your name. Amen.